Luke 9 verse 31. One word, sitting in the middle of a sentence most readings skim straight past. Moses and Elijah appear next to Jesus, glowing, and Luke tells us exactly what the three of them were talking about. Not eternity. Not doctrine. Luke says they spoke of his exodos, his exodus, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Every English Bible translates that word differently. Departure. Decease. Death. None of them tell you what Luke is actually doing. He had a perfectly ordinary Greek word for death sitting right there. He didn't use it. He reached for the one word in the entire language guaranteed to make a Jewish reader's mind go straight to one specific story. The story of a nation walking out of slavery, through water, into a wilderness, toward a promise. Luke is telling you, in a single word, what the cross is actually going to be. Not a tragedy that interrupts the plan. An exodus. And the fact that almost nobody stops on this word long enough to ask why Luke chose it is exactly why this scene gets flattened into, Jesus glowed on a mountain. A special effect. Instead of what it actually is, the moment Israel's whole story quietly folds itself into one man walking toward a city that's about to kill him. To see why that word lands as hard as it does, you have to back up 6 days. Because Luke doesn't let this scene float free of what comes right before it, and neither should you. Just before the mountain, Jesus asks his disciples a blunt question: who do people say I am? They give him the safe answers: John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the old prophets come back. Then he narrows it: who do you say I am? Peter answers first, and he gets it right. You are the Christ, the Messiah, the one Israel has been waiting for. And Jesus' very next move is to tell them exactly what that title is about to cost. He says the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, be killed, and on the third day be raised. Peter, in Matthew's version of this same moment, actually pulls Jesus aside and rebukes him for saying it. That cannot happen to you. And Jesus' response to Peter is about as sharp as anything he says in the Gospels: get behind me. Because you're not thinking God's thoughts, you're thinking human ones. That's the argument sitting in the room 6 days before this mountain. Peter has just said the right words: you are the Messiah, while completely rejecting what being the Messiah is actually going to mean. And 6 days later, 3 of these same disciples watch Moses and Elijah show up and calmly discuss the very thing Peter tried to talk Jesus out of. As if it were simply, obviously, the plan all along. Luke tells you Jesus took Peter, John, and James and went up onto a mountain to pray. That's it. No name. Every other detail in this scene gets a label: the men are named, the voice is quoted, the cloud is described. But the mountain itself stays anonymous, and it has stayed that way for 2,000 years of people trying to pin it down. Tradition since at least the 4th century points to Mount Tabor, a rounded hill rising alone out of the Jezreel Valley in Galilee. Distinct enough on the horizon that it's easy to imagine as the mountain, and a church has stood on its summit, rebuilt across centuries, marking that belief. The problem is Tabor sits barely 2,000 feet high. And by the 1st century it likely had a fortified town on top of it, not the kind of empty, private summit Luke's story seems to need. The other candidate is Mount Hermon, towering near 10,000 feet on the northern border, snow-capped, genuinely remote. And geography argues for it. The scene just before this one, Peter's confession, happens at Caesarea Philippi, which sits at the base of Hermon. If Jesus and the disciples simply kept walking from where the text already has them, Hermon is right there. Scholars remain divided, and serious ones on both sides admit the honest answer is we don't know. Luke had the option to tell you. He didn't. And the more you sit with that choice, the more it looks less like an oversight and more like a signal: this scene isn't about a place you can visit. It's about what happens on top of it. It's worth noticing how differently the Gospel writers treat this compared to other locations in their accounts. Bethlehem gets named. Nazareth gets named. Capernaum, Jericho, the Sea of Galilee, the Pool of Siloam, all named, all specific, all places a first-century reader could have walked to. The mountain of the Transfiguration is the one major setting in the Gospels that stays deliberately, consistently unidentified across all three synoptic accounts. Matthew, Mark, and Luke each had the chance to add a name if they had one. None of them did. Whatever mattered enough to preserve about this event, its exact coordinates weren't part of it. Which is itself a small but pointed contrast with a story literally named after a journey out of one specific place toward another. Here's a smaller detail, the kind you'd only notice if you read the same story in two Gospels back to back. Matthew and Mark both say this happens, after 6 days. Luke says, about 8 days after these sayings. Skeptics have pointed at this for centuries as a contradiction. It isn't one, and the reason why is worth pausing on, because it tells you something about how these writers worked. Matthew and Mark are almost certainly counting the days between the two events, the confession at Caesarea Philippi and the mountain. Not including either end. Luke, writing with a more Greek, inclusive counting style, is almost certainly counting both the day of the confession and the day of the mountain themselves, landing him 2 days ahead of the other two. Same 6-day gap. Two different counting conventions layered on top of it. It's a small thing. But it's worth naming, because it's the kind of detail that separates four independent, imperfectly harmonized human accounts from one that was scripted for consistency. Nobody smoothed this out. Nobody needed to. It was never a problem for people who understood how their own culture counted days. Only for readers 2,000 years and one culture removed, squinting at English translations side by side. Luke, notably, is the one Gospel writer here who wasn't present for any of this himself. He says as much in his opening lines. He's compiling an orderly account from those who were eyewitnesses, doing the work of a careful historian rather than writing straight from memory. A writer trying to fabricate a seamless, coordinated record generally doesn't introduce a 2-day discrepancy his own sources would have let him smooth over. The gap reads far more like what it almost certainly is, independent testimony, filtered through slightly different counting habits. Preserved honestly rather than polished into artificial agreement. Then Luke tells you who's standing there talking with Jesus, Moses and Elijah. And if you know anything about either man, this is not a random pairing. Moses represents the law, the 5 books. The covenant given at Sinai, the entire legal and sacrificial framework Israel had lived inside for over 1,000 years by this point. Elijah represents the prophets, not because he wrote anything down himself, but because in Jewish tradition he stood as the prophet. The one expected to return before the coming of the Lord, the figure Malachi's final prophecy names by name. Law and prophets. Together, in first-century Jewish shorthand, those two words meant the entire Hebrew Bible, everything Israel understood God to have said, up to that point. And both of these specific men already had their own mountain story. Moses went up Sinai and came down with his face changed after being in God's presence. That story is coming up next. Elijah, fleeing for his life after facing down the prophets of Baal, walked 40 days into the wilderness to Horeb. Another name for the same mountain range, and there had his own encounter with God, in the quiet after the wind and earthquake and fire. Both men had stood where the divine broke into the ordinary and left them changed. Both men, according to Jewish tradition, left this world in unusual ways. Moses died alone on a mountain with God and was buried by no human hand. Elijah never died at all, taken up in a whirlwind. And now both of them are standing in front of 3 very ordinary fishermen, talking with Jesus like old colleagues about to hand off a project. There's also a chronological gap here worth sitting with for a second, because it's easy to read past. By the time of this mountain, Moses has been dead for well over 1,000 years. Elijah was taken up roughly 8 or 9 centuries earlier. These aren't symbolic stand-ins conjured for the occasion. Luke describes them appearing, in glory, fully present. Recognizable enough that Peter knows exactly who he's looking at without anyone introducing them. Whatever category of existence these two men were in before this moment. The mountain briefly, visibly connects it to the present, collapsing 1,000 years of Israel's history into one conversation on one summit. Luke says that as Jesus prayed, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Other gospel writers add that his face shone like the sun. This is where the word transfiguration comes from, not a costume change. But Jesus' own nature becoming visible through the ordinary body the disciples had been walking beside for months. This is worth setting directly next to Moses' own story, because the echo is exact and the difference is the whole point. After Moses came down from Sinai carrying the second set of tablets, Exodus says the skin of his face was shining. So much so that Aaron and the people were afraid to come near him. And Moses had to wear a veil when he wasn't speaking directly with God. But that account is explicit about the source. Moses' face shone because he had been talking with the Lord. The glory was reflected. Borrowed. It came from proximity to something outside himself, and by every indication it eventually faded, which is why he needed to keep going back. Jesus' face doesn't reflect a light source standing somewhere else. On this mountain, he is the light source. Luke never says Jesus went and stood near something glorious and came back changed. The change happens while he's praying, in front of the 3 men watching, and nothing outside him explains where the light is coming from. Moses needed a veil to hide a glory that wasn't naturally his. Jesus needs no veil, because for the brief window of this scene, the ordinary human face the disciples knew simply stops hiding what was underneath it the entire time. There's a reason this distinction mattered enormously to the early church, long after the mountain itself was a memory. If Jesus' glory here was only reflected, borrowed, like Moses's, then the Transfiguration would just be one more prophet having one more vivid encounter with God, impressive but not fundamentally different from Sinai or Horeb. But if the glory is his own, then this mountain is making a claim none of the earlier ones ever made, that the God who spoke from clouds and burning bushes and still small voices for 1,000 years was. On this particular afternoon, standing in front of 3 fishermen in a body they could have reached out and touched. Now go back to that word from the opening, exodos, because this is where it lands. Luke doesn't leave the conversation vague. Moses and Elijah spoke of his exodus, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Not his death in general terms. A specific, named event, with a specific destination already fixed on the calendar. Jerusalem. The city Jesus has already told his disciples will reject him, 6 days earlier, on the very same trip. Think about who's having this conversation. Moses, who led Israel's exodus out of Egypt, through the sea, through the wilderness, toward a covenant sealed in blood at Sinai. Elijah, the prophet who confronted a nation's collapse into idolatry and called it back. And now the 2 of them are discussing, apparently as settled. Established fact, the next exodus, one that isn't going to move a nation out of a country. It's going to move humanity out of its bondage to sin and death, and the sea it crosses isn't made of water. This is the detail that should stop you. Peter tried to talk Jesus out of the cross 6 days earlier, treating it like a catastrophe to be prevented. Moses and Elijah, 2 men who represent the entire prior revelation of God to Israel, are on this mountain treating the same event as the fulfillment their own stories had been pointing toward the whole time. The law and the prophets aren't confused by the cross. They're the ones explaining it. Notice, too, what this conversation implies about how Moses and Elijah understood their own lives, looking back on them from wherever they were speaking from. Moses spent 40 years leading a people who complained, rebelled, and buried an entire generation in the wilderness before any of them reached the promise. Elijah spent his ministry watching a nation slide back into idol worship again and again. And at his lowest point asked God to just let him die under a broom tree, convinced the whole project had failed. Neither man's exodus looked, in the moment, like unqualified success. And here they are, centuries later, discussing a second, greater exodus with the person accomplishing it, not with despair, but with what Luke's wording suggests was simple. Settled clarity about what needed to happen next. If their own imperfect, costly exodus still mattered enough to discuss on a mountain of glory. It's worth asking what that says about the value of the struggling, unfinished chapters of an ordinary life. And then Peter talks. Luke is almost gentle about it, adding the detail that Peter did not know what he said. This is a man watching something he cannot categorize, filling the silence the only way he knows how. His idea, let's build 3 shelters. One for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. The word is the same one used for the temporary booths Israelites built during the Feast of Tabernacles, commemorating the wilderness years. Tents thrown up to mark a sacred, temporary dwelling. On the surface, it even sounds respectful. Let's mark this. Let's build something to hold on to it. But the structure of the sentence gives away the actual problem. 3 shelters, 1 each, side by side. Equal size, presumably, equal honor. Peter is trying to put Moses, Elijah, and Jesus on the same level, 3 great figures of God's people, worth equal monuments. It's the same instinct that made him rebuke Jesus for talking about the cross, an inability, even now, even watching this, to grasp that Jesus isn't the next great prophet in a line. He's the one the line was always pointing toward. Luke doesn't record anyone answering Peter. What answers him instead is what happens next. It's worth being fair to Peter here. Because it's easy to turn this into a joke at his expense, and that misses something real about the moment. He has just watched 2 men he almost certainly grew up hearing about in synagogue, figures from scrolls, from festivals, from centuries-old memory. Standing in front of him, solid and speaking. Most people, confronted with something that overwhelming, reach for a ritual, a structure, anything with a known shape to hold on to. Building shelters was a recognizably religious response, drawn from a real festival with real meaning. Peter isn't being flippant. He's doing what frightened, well-meaning people do when they're handed something too large for the categories they already have. He reaches for the nearest sacred pattern he knows and tries to fit the moment inside it. The problem was never that he responded. It's that the pattern he reached for still had Moses and Elijah standing shoulder to shoulder with the one they'd come to talk about, instead of underneath him. While Peter is still talking, a cloud comes and overshadows them, and the text says the disciples were afraid as they entered the cloud. If that reaction seems disproportionate for weather, it's because this isn't weather. This is the same cloud that sat over Mount Sinai when Moses went up to receive the law. That filled the tabernacle so completely the priests couldn't enter it, that later filled Solomon's temple at its dedication. In the Hebrew Bible, a cloud like this is shorthand for one specific thing, the visible, veiled presence of God Himself. Close enough to touch and too much to look at directly. Moses spent 40 days inside a cloud like this on a mountain, receiving instructions for how Israel would worship. Now 3 fishermen stand inside the same kind of cloud, on another mountain, and what comes out of it isn't a law written on stone. It's a voice. There's a detail easy to miss in how Luke sequences this. The cloud arrives while Peter is still mid-sentence, still talking about his 3 shelters. It isn't a response that waits politely for him to finish. It interrupts him. Whatever Peter was about to propose next, the text simply doesn't record it, because the cloud makes finishing the thought impossible. That timing alone tells you something about how the scene wants to be read, not as a gentle correction offered once Peter was done talking, but as an immediate, overwhelming answer to a well-meaning idea that needed to be stopped before it went any further. The voice says, "This is my son, my chosen one, listen to him." That last phrase isn't a generic instruction to pay attention. It's a direct echo of something Moses himself said, centuries earlier, in Deuteronomy, that God would raise up a prophet like him from among the people, and that Israel must listen to that prophet when he comes. For 1,000 years, that promise sat there, unfulfilled, waiting. Devout Jews in the first century were actively watching for the prophet, a specific, expected figure, distinct even from the Messiah in some strands of Jewish expectation. The voice on the mountain answers that waiting directly, in language deliberately built from Moses's own words, while Moses is standing right there. It's not a coincidence of phrasing. It's a formal handoff, delivered by God's own voice, in front of the very man whose ancient promise is being fulfilled. And notice what happens immediately after. Luke says that when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. Moses and Elijah are simply gone. The law and the prophets don't linger on stage once the voice has said, "Listen to him," they've done their work, pointing to this moment. And now they step back, leaving only the one they were pointing to. Put the whole exchange side by side and the shape of it becomes hard to miss. Peter proposes three equal shelters, Jesus, Moses, Elijah, side by side. The voice from the cloud answers with one sentence that names only one of the three, and tells the disciples to listen to him alone. It's about as direct a correction as Scripture ever gives, delivered not through argument but through simple absence. The two men Peter wanted to honor equally are the two men who vanish the moment the correction is given. And the one left standing in the empty space where three shelters would have stood is the one the voice actually named. Luke's version of this story doesn't let the mountain stay a private, glowing memory for long. The very next scene is the next day, coming down. And it's about as far from mountaintop glory as a story can get, a man in the crowd begging Jesus to look at his son. His only child, seized by a spirit that convulses him and throws him into fire and water, foaming at the mouth. A boy the other disciples, the ones who stayed behind, had already tried and failed to heal. Put those two scenes back to back and the point sharpens instead of softening. On the mountain, glory, Moses, Elijah, a voice from a cloud, talk of an exodus that will free humanity from its deepest bondage. At the base of the mountain, immediately after, one specific, suffering child. And a group of well-meaning disciples who don't have what it takes to help him. The mountain isn't an escape from the world's brokenness. It's the reason Jesus is walking toward Jerusalem in the first place. The exodus Moses and Elijah were discussing has to happen precisely because there are boys like this one, convulsing at the bottom of every mountain anyone has ever climbed looking for God. Luke doesn't soften the disciples' failure here either. When Jesus asks what they were arguing about, the Father explains that he begged the remaining disciples to cast the spirit out. And they couldn't do it. Jesus' response is unusually blunt for him. He calls the generation faithless and twisted, and asks how much longer he must bear with them. That frustration only makes sense against the backdrop of what just happened one mountain away. Three of these same men had just watched Moses, Elijah, a cloud of glory, and the voice of God confirm exactly who Jesus is, and at the bottom of the mountain. The wider group of disciples still can't act like it. The gap between what was revealed on the summit and what the disciples could manage in the valley is, in its own smaller way, the same gap this whole Exodus is meant to close. If a video like this one has helped you notice a detail in Scripture you'd walked past 100 times before, consider subscribing. That's genuinely the whole aim here, slowing down long enough to see what's actually written. Now back to the mountain. So bring it back to where this started. One word, exodos, sitting quietly in verse 31, doing more work than any other single word in the passage. Luke could have written that Moses and Elijah spoke of Jesus' death, and every reader would have understood exactly what he meant. He didn't write that. He wrote the one word guaranteed to make a Jewish audience's mind jump straight to a burning bush. A sea splitting in half, and a nation walking out of slavery into a promise it hadn't earned. That's what this mountain is actually telling you. Not that Jesus glowed, once, and then it was over. That the entire architecture of the story Israel had been living inside for over 1,000 years, the law that Moses carried down one mountain. The prophetic voice that called Israel back to God on another, was never a separate story from the one about to unfold in Jerusalem. It was always this story, seen from further back. Moses led one exodus out of a country. Jesus was 6 days and one mountain away from leading another one, out of the deepest slavery there is. And for one unguarded moment on an unnamed summit, the veil came off long enough for 3 frightened fishermen, and for anyone reading this since, to see exactly what that word had been pointing toward the whole time. There's a reason Peter, decades later, still couldn't let this scene go. In his second letter, an old man now, close to his own death, Peter doesn't reach for parables or arguments to defend what he believes about Jesus, he reaches for this exact mountain. He writes that he and the others were eyewitnesses of his majesty, that they heard the voice come from the cloud themselves, on the holy mountain. Whatever else Peter misunderstood in the moment, the 3 shelters. The instinct to make Jesus equal with Moses and Elijah instead of set apart from them. The core of what he saw stayed with him until the end of his life as the thing he reached for when he needed proof he hadn't been following a clever story. And that, in the end, is what makes the word in verse 31 worth stopping on in the first place. An exodus, by definition, isn't the destination. It's the walking out, the specific, costly, unfinished middle of a journey that started in bondage and hasn't yet reached the promise. Moses' exodus took 40 years and an entire generation who never got to see where it ended. Whatever this second greater exodus asks of the people walking it now, the 2 men standing on that mountain. The ones who already knew exactly what an unfinished exodus costs, apparently thought it was worth discussing calmly, in glory. 6 days after everyone else it was still just a rumor of suffering to come.